Blood dripped onto the stone floor of the war tent, and no one dared to move closer to the man who was losing it. Alpha King Cale Ashford stood with his back against a wooden post, one hand pressed hard against his ribs, his jaw locked tight against the pain. The battle at the northern border had ended only an hour ago, and the smell of smoke still clung to his torn shirt. Around him, his warriors kept their distance, their eyes darting toward the entrance of the tent and back to their king, unsure of what to do. 3 healers had already tried to approach him. 3 healers had already been sent away, with nothing but a growl and a warning glare. "I said I don't need anyone," Cale snapped, his voice rough, when a 4th healer stepped forward with trembling hands. The young man froze mid-step, then quickly retreated, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the ground before disappearing through the tent flap. Beta Garrick Doyle stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching his king bleed with a look of quiet frustration. He had fought beside Cale for over a decade, had seen him take worse wounds without complaint, but this one was different. The gash across his ribs was deep, deeper than Cale wanted anyone to know, and if it wasn't cleaned soon, infection would set in before nightfall. "You're going to lose more blood standing there being stubborn than you did in the actual fight," Garrick said flatly. "Then I'll lose it standing," Cale replied, not even looking at him. Garrick sighed and stepped outside the tent, scanning the makeshift camp that had been set up along the tree line. Wounded warriors sat on crates and fallen logs, some being tended by healers, others waiting their turn with gritted teeth. He needed someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk into that tent and do what 3 others had failed to do. That was when he saw her. She was kneeling beside an injured young man near the supply carts, her hands moving quickly and calmly as she wrapped a bandage around his forearm. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, strands falling loose around her face from hours of work. She didn't look up when she spoke to her patient, her voice low and steady, the kind of voice that made people feel safe even when everything around them was falling apart. Garrick didn't know her name. She wasn't one of the senior healers, wasn't someone he recognized from the palace halls. But something about the way she worked, unshaken and precise, even after a full day of treating wounded soldiers, told him she might be exactly what he needed. "You," he called out, walking toward her. "What's your name?" She looked up, startled, for only a second, before her expression settled into calm attentiveness. "Illyra Voss." "Illyra Voss," Garrick repeated. "How steady are your hands?" "Steady enough," she said simply, tying off the bandage on her patient's arm with a practiced knot. "Good. Because the king is bleeding, and he's already turned away 3 healers. I need someone who isn't afraid to walk in there and do the job anyway." Something flickered behind Illyra's eyes, gone before Garrick could name it. She stood, wiping her hands on the cloth tied around her waist, and nodded once. "Take me to him." Garrick studied her for a moment, half expecting her to hesitate, to ask questions, to show even a trace of the fear the others had shown. She didn't. She simply gathered a small bag of supplies and followed him toward the tent without another word. What Garrick didn't notice, what no one in the camp had noticed all day, was the way Illyra kept her left arm slightly bent, favoring it without drawing attention. Beneath the long sleeve of her healer's tunic, wrapped tightly with a strip of cloth she had torn from the hem of her own dress, was a wound of her own. It throbbed with every step she took, a deep set of claw marks she had earned hours earlier while pulling 2 pups away from a rogue wolf during the chaos of the retreat. She hadn't told anyone. There hadn't been time, and there had been so many others who needed help more urgently than she did. She pushed the pain to the back of her mind, the way she always did, and stepped into the tent. The air inside was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Cale stood near the post, his massive frame tense, eyes closed, as he tried to steady his breathing. When the tent flap moved, his eyes snapped open, sharp and warning. "I told Garrick I don't need." "You're bleeding through your shirt," Illyra interrupted, already moving toward the supply table to lay out her tools. "And from the way you're holding your side, that wound has gone deeper than you're letting anyone believe." Cale's eyes narrowed. No one spoke to him like that. Not healers, not warriors, not even his own advisors most days. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation, only the calm authority of someone who had decided the conversation about whether she would help him was already over. "Who are you?" he asked, more curious than angry. "Someone who is going to clean that wound, whether you agree to it or not," she said, pulling a clean cloth and a small jar of salve from her bag. "You can sit, or you can keep standing and make this harder than it needs to be. Either way, I'm not leaving until it's done." For a long moment, Cale simply stared at her, waiting for the fear to show, the way it always did, eventually. It never came. Her hands were steady as she approached him, her expression focused entirely on the wound, rather than on the fact that she was standing inches from the most powerful man in the region, a man known for his temper as much as his strength. He didn't sit, but he didn't stop her either. Illyra reached for the torn edge of his shirt, gently pulling the fabric aside to get a better look at the injury. It was worse than she expected, a long gash that ran from just below his ribs toward his hip, the edges jagged from whatever claw or blade had caused it. She kept her face neutral, refusing to let him see any reaction that might make him more anxious about the severity of it. "This needs stitches," she said, already reaching for a needle and thread from her bag. "It's deep, and if it isn't closed properly, you'll be dealing with a much worse problem in a few days." "Do what you need to do," Cale said, his voice quieter now, some of the sharp edge gone from it. She worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound first, with a cloth soaked in something that made him hiss through his teeth, though he refused to make any louder sound than that. She noticed the way his muscles tensed with each pass of the cloth, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, but he never once told her to stop. "You're not afraid of me," he said eventually, watching her thread the needle with careful precision. "Should I be?" she asked, not looking up. "Most people are. Most people aren't focused on stopping you from bleeding to death in a tent," she replied. "I don't have time to be afraid right now. Maybe later." A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close to it. He watched her begin the first stitch, her hands moving with a steadiness that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances, given who he was, and what his reputation carried through every pack in the region. "You didn't answer my question," he said. "Your name?" "Illyra," she said simply, focused on her work. "Illyra," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "You work with the healers?" "I am one," she said, though not one anyone usually calls for royalty. "Why not?" She paused for just a moment, her needle hovering above his skin. "Because I'm not important enough to be remembered, I suppose. There are healers with more experience, more standing. I mostly treat the warriors no one else has time for." Cale studied her profile as she returned to her work, something in her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. He had a court full of people who fought for his attention, who angled for his favor, who would have given anything to be standing where she stood right now, tending to his wound with the promise of royal gratitude waiting at the end of it. And here was someone who had walked in expecting nothing, offering nothing but competent hands and a complete lack of fear. The stitching continued in silence for several minutes. Illyra worked quickly but carefully, her focus entirely on the task, occasionally glancing up to check that he was tolerating the pain, though she never asked him directly. She could tell from the set of his jaw and the tightness in his shoulders that he was gritting through it without complaint, the way men like him always did. When she finally tied off the last stitch and reached for a clean bandage to wrap around his ribs, Cale let out a slow breath, some of the tension easing from his frame for the first time since he had returned from the battlefield. "There," she said, securing the bandage in place. "Try not to move too much for the next few days. If it starts to feel hot or swollen, that means infection, and you'll need to send for someone immediately. Don't wait like you did with treating it in the first place." "Is that an order?" Cale asked, one eyebrow raised. "It's advice," Illyra said, already gathering her supplies back into her bag. "You can do whatever you want with it. I'm only responsible for the stitching." She turned to leave, and something in Cale wanted to stop her, wanted to ask her more questions, wanted to understand why she had walked into this tent with more courage than warriors twice her size. But he said nothing, watching instead as she slipped out through the tent flap without waiting to be dismissed, without bowing, without any of the ceremony that usually surrounded interactions with him. Outside, the evening air was cool against Illyra's face, a welcome relief after the heat and tension of the tent. She walked a short distance before pausing behind one of the supply carts, out of sight from the rest of the camp, and finally allowed herself to lean against the wooden frame for support. Her left arm throbbed with a deep, insistent pain that she had been ignoring for hours. the wrapped cloth beneath her sleeve now damp in a way she didn't want to think too closely about. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then carefully rolled up her sleeve just enough to check the bandage. The cloth had darkened considerably since she last looked at it, the wound beneath clearly still bleeding more than she wanted to admit. She pressed her hand against it, wincing at the fresh spike of pain, and quickly rolled the sleeve back down before anyone could see. There were still other wounded to check on. The king's injury had been the most urgent, but not the only one, and there were warriors scattered throughout the camp who needed her attention just as badly, if not more. Her own wound would have to wait. It always did. She pushed off from the cart and walked back toward the rows of injured soldiers, her steps steady, despite the pain radiating up her arm, her face carefully arranged into the same calm expression she always wore. No one needed to know. No one needed to worry about her when there were so many others who needed care more urgently. Behind her, inside the tent, Cale sat down slowly for the first time since the battle had ended, his fingers brushing lightly over the fresh bandage at his side. He found himself thinking about the healer who had walked in without fear, who had spoken to him like he was simply a man with a wound, rather than a king who commanded absolute obedience. It was a small thing, an unremarkable exchange in the grand scheme of the day's events, and yet it lingered in his mind long after she had gone, refusing to be pushed aside the way most passing encounters usually were. He didn't know it yet, but the woman who had just stitched his wound was carrying one of her own, hidden beneath cloth and silence, untreated and worsening with every hour that passed, and he wouldn't find out the truth of it for several more days, not until the consequences of her silence became impossible to ignore. For now, he simply sat in the quiet of the tent, staring at the spot where she had stood, wondering why a healer with no name recognition, and no standing in his court, had managed to unsettle him more than any battle he had fought that day. 3 days after the battle, Cale found himself standing at the window of his private study, staring out over the training grounds without truly seeing anything. His ribs still ached beneath the bandage, a dull reminder of the injury that had brought a stranger into his tent, but that wasn't what occupied his thoughts. It was the stranger herself. He had asked Garrick to find out more about her, expecting the request to be forgotten within the day, amid the chaos of returning warriors and reports from the border. Instead, Garrick appeared in the doorway of his study that very morning, with a look of mild amusement on his face. "You wanted information on the healer," Garrick said, stepping inside without waiting for permission, a habit Cale had long since stopped correcting. Elira Voss, 24 years old, no family connections within the court, no ties to any of the ruling houses. She trained under Old Marin before he passed, and she's worked as a field healer ever since, mostly treating warriors and lower-ranked pack members. "That's it?" Cale asked, turning from the window. "That's what anyone seems to know," Garrick said with a shrug. "She keeps to herself. Doesn't attend the gatherings, doesn't seek attention. A few of the other healers mention she works harder than anyone else, but rarely gets the credit for it. Apparently she's the one who ends up treating whoever no one else has time for." Cale absorbed this information in silence, turning it over in his mind. It matched what he had already gathered from their brief encounter. A woman who worked without expecting recognition, who walked into danger without asking whether it was her place to do so. "Have her sent for," Cale said finally. "I want my stitches checked." Garrick raised an eyebrow. "Your stitches are fine. I can see that from here." "Have her sent for anyway," Cale repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Garrick studied his king for a long moment, a slow understanding creeping into his expression, though he wisely chose not to comment on it. He gave a short nod and left to carry out the order, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts once more. An hour later, Elira arrived at the entrance of the study, escorted by one of the palace guards who announced her presence before stepping back to allow her through. She walked in with the same calm composure she had shown in the tent, though there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes as she took in the grandeur of the room, the tall shelves lined with books, the heavy wooden desk, the windows that overlooked the entire training grounds below. "You wanted your stitches checked," she said, setting her bag down on a nearby table, without waiting for an invitation to do so. "That's what I told Garrick to tell you," Cale said, watching her closely. Something in his tone made her pause, her eyes narrowing slightly, as she studied him. "Is there another reason you called me here?" "Should there be?" "I don't know," Elira said honestly. "You're the king. You don't need a reason to call anyone anywhere." Cale found himself almost smiling at the bluntness of her response, a reaction he wasn't used to having toward anyone in his court. He gestured toward the chair near his desk, and after a moment of hesitation, he sat down himself, allowing her to approach and lift the edge of his shirt to examine the bandage beneath. She worked with the same efficient precision she had shown before, unwrapping the bandage carefully and inspecting the stitches with a critical eye. Cale watched her face rather than her hands, noting the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the way her lips pressed together when she was focused on something important. "The stitches look good," she said after a moment. "No signs of infection. You're healing well." "Because I followed your advice," Cale said. "That would be a first," Elira replied, glancing up at him with the faintest hint of amusement. "Most men in your position don't listen to advice from anyone, let alone a healer they only just met." "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, returning her attention to rewrapping the bandage. "I suppose you're not." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, though Cale found himself searching for something to say, some way to keep the conversation going a little longer than necessary. It was an unfamiliar impulse, one he hadn't felt in longer than he cared to admit. Most conversations in his life were transactional, filled with requests and demands and careful political maneuvering. This felt different, simpler somehow, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Why did you become a healer?" he asked, as she finished securing the bandage. Elira paused, her hands stilling for just a moment before she continued her work. "Because someone needs to be there when people are hurting," she said simply. "It never made sense to me, the idea of walking past someone in pain because it wasn't convenient to stop and help. That's a simple answer for something that sounds much more complicated." She glanced up at him, something guarded settling into her expression. Not everything needs to be complicated to be true. Cale studied her for a moment, sensing there was more beneath the surface of her answer, some deeper reason she wasn't willing to share with a man she had known for only a handful of days. He didn't push further, though the curiosity lingered, a quiet itch at the back of his mind that refused to fade. As she gathered her supplies to leave, Cale noticed something he hadn't caught before, a slight stiffness in the way she moved her left arm, a careful avoidance of putting any weight or pressure on it as she reached for the strap of her bag. It was subtle, easy to miss if he hadn't been paying close attention, but he had spent years reading the smallest signals of pain and weakness in his warriors, and the instinct didn't fail him now. "Your arm," he said, before she could reach the door. "Is something wrong with it?" Elira froze for the briefest moment before turning back to face him, her expression carefully neutral. "It's nothing. Just sore from carrying supplies all week." "You're favoring it." "I'm tired," she said, offering a small, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been a long few days for everyone, healers included." Cale watched her closely, unconvinced by the explanation, but unable to press the matter without overstepping a boundary he wasn't entirely sure existed between them. She was, after all, still a stranger to him, someone he had no real claim over, no right to demand answers from beyond what was professionally necessary. "If something is wrong, you should have someone look at it," he said instead. "It would be foolish for a healer to ignore her own injuries while tending to everyone else's." "I'll keep that in mind," Elira said, though the tone of her voice suggested she had no intention of doing any such thing. She gave a short nod and turned to leave, disappearing through the doorway before Cale could say anything further. He sat alone in his study for a long while after she had gone, the earlier ease of their conversation replaced by a low, simmering concern he couldn't quite shake. There had been something in the way she deflected his question. Too quick, too practiced, the kind of response someone gives when they've had plenty of experience hiding the truth. Later that evening, word reached him through one of the kitchen staff that the healer named Elira had been seen leaving the supply room with an unusually large bundle of bandages, more than would typically be needed for treating minor training injuries. It was a small detail, the kind of thing most people would never think twice about, but combined with the stiffness in her arm and her deflective answer, it settled into Cale's mind as one more piece of a puzzle he was slowly beginning to assemble. He thought about summoning her again, about demanding a straight answer this time, but something told him that approach would only push her further into silence. She wasn't the kind of person who responded well to pressure or command. If anything, she seemed to close off more tightly the harder someone tried to force information out of her. Instead, he decided to watch. quietly, carefully, the way he might observe a wounded animal that had learned not to trust anyone who approached too quickly. If something truly was wrong, he would find a way to help her, even if she never asked for it herself. Over the following 2 days, Cale found small reasons to keep Alira nearby. He requested her presence during a review of the camp's medical supplies, claiming he wanted to understand what resources had been depleted during the recent conflict. He asked for her opinion on a minor injury sustained by one of his younger warriors during training, though any of the senior healers could have handled it just as easily. Each time, she arrived promptly, professional and composed, offering clear and useful insight, without ever acknowledging that the reasons for her presence seemed increasingly unnecessary. Garrick noticed the pattern before anyone else did, watching his king with a mixture of curiosity and quiet concern. He had known Cale long enough to recognize when something had shifted in him, some crack in the carefully maintained control he exercised over every aspect of his life. It wasn't like him to seek out the company of anyone outside his closest circle, let alone a low-ranking healer with no political significance whatsoever. "You're spending a lot of time with her," Garrick commented one evening, finding Cale in his study once again, staring at reports he clearly wasn't reading. "She's competent," Cale said simply, not looking up. "There are a dozen competent healers in this palace," Garrick replied. "You've never called for any of them the way you've been calling for her." Cale didn't answer immediately, his jaw tightening slightly at the observation. He knew Garrick was right, knew there was something unusual happening in the way his thoughts kept returning to a woman he had known for less than a week. But he wasn't ready to examine that too closely, not when there were more pressing concerns weighing on his mind, namely, the stiffness in her arm that never seemed to improve, and the growing suspicion that she was hiding something far more serious than simple exhaustion. "Keep an eye on her," Cale said finally, quietly. "I want to know if anything changes." Garrick studied his king for a long moment, then gave a slow nod, understanding that whatever this was, it had already taken root too deeply to be dismissed as simple curiosity. He left without further comment, leaving Cale alone once again, with his thoughts and the persistent, nagging worry that something was wrong beneath the calm surface Alira presented to the world. What neither of them knew was just how right that worry would prove to be, and how little time remained before the truth would no longer stay hidden. The pain in Alira's arm had become a constant companion by the time she returned to her small room that night, one she had learned to carry the way she carried everything else, quietly and without complaint. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her roommate, Nadia Ellison, looked up from the small table where she was mending a torn sleeve, her eyes immediately narrowing with concern. Nadia had shared this room with Alira for nearly 2 years, long enough to know the difference between ordinary tiredness and something more serious. "You look terrible," Nadia said bluntly, setting down her needle. "Thank you," Alira replied dryly, moving toward her bed and sitting down slowly, careful not to jostle her arm. "I'm serious. You've barely eaten in days, and you keep holding your arm like it's made of glass." Nadia stood and crossed the room, reaching for Alira's sleeve before she could pull away. "Let me see it." "It's fine," Alira said, pulling her arm back instinctively. "You keep saying that, and I keep not believing you." Nadia's expression softened slightly, though her concern remained evident. "Alira, you treat everyone else in this palace like their pain matters more than anything else in the world. Why won't you let anyone do the same for you?" Alira looked away, staring at the small window across the room, where the last light of evening was fading into darkness. It was a question she didn't have a good answer for, not one she was willing to say out loud, at least. The truth was tangled up in years of learning, that her own needs came last, that there would always be someone else whose pain seemed more urgent, more deserving of attention. "I'll manage," Alira said quietly. Nadia sighed, recognizing the familiar wall going up between them, the same one that always appeared whenever the conversation turned toward Alira's own well-being. She had tried this conversation more times than she could count over the past 2 years, and it always ended the same way, with Alira deflecting, and Nadia reluctantly letting the matter drop, unwilling to push too hard and risk damaging the fragile trust between them. "At least let me get you something to eat," Nadia said instead, moving toward the small kitchen area they shared. "You won't heal from anything if you don't take care of yourself at all." Alira managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you." Alone with her thoughts while Nadia prepared a simple meal, Illyra finally allowed herself to examine the wound beneath her sleeve, wincing as she carefully unwrapped the layers of cloth she had changed and rewrapped so many times over the past several days. The skin around the claw marks had taken on an angry red color, warm to the touch in a way that made her stomach tighten with worry. She knew what that meant, had diagnosed the same signs in countless patients before. Infection was setting in, slow and steady, exactly the kind of thing she warned others to watch for and treat immediately. She should have gone to one of the senior healers days ago. She knew that. But there had been so many others to treat, so many warriors with injuries far more severe than her own, and somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that her wound could wait, that it wasn't significant enough to take time away from people who needed her more. Her mind drifted back to the moment the injury had happened, 3 days before the battle officially ended, during the chaotic retreat, when a group of pups had been separated from their mothers, amid the confusion of fighting wolves and panicked screaming. She had been nearby, tending to a minor injury on one of the older warriors, when she heard the cries of the children and saw a rogue wolf closing in on them with terrifying speed. There hadn't been time to think, only to act. She had thrown herself between the wolf and the pups, using whatever was within reach to fend it off long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The claws had caught her arm in the struggle, a deep, tearing pain that she had pushed aside immediately in favor of ensuring the children made it safely away from the danger. No one had witnessed the moment clearly enough to understand what had happened, and in the chaos that followed, Illyra had simply wrapped the wound herself and continued working, treating dozens of other injuries throughout the rest of that day and the days that followed. It had seemed like the right choice at the time, the only choice really, given how many people needed help and how few healers were available to provide it. Now, staring at the inflamed skin and feeling the heat radiating from beneath her fingertips, she began to understand just how serious a mistake that choice might have been. "Food's ready," Nadia called from across the room, and Illyra quickly rewrapped her arm, pulling her sleeve back down before her roommate could see anything. They ate together in comfortable silence for a while, though Illyra noticed Nadia glancing at her more than once, concern still evident despite the lighter conversation they maintained about mundane palace happenings. When the meal was finished, Nadia gathered the dishes and returned to her mending, leaving Illyra alone with her thoughts once again. She thought about the king, about the strange series of summons she had received over the past few days, each one carrying a thin pretense of professional necessity that both of them seemed to understand wasn't entirely true. There was something unsettling about the way he watched her during those visits, an attentiveness that felt different from simple curiosity, though she couldn't quite name what it was. She had noticed him noticing her arm, had felt the weight of his gaze linger on the stiffness in her movements, longer than casual observation would explain. It worried her, not because she feared punishment for hiding an injury, but because she wasn't ready for anyone to see past the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. If Kale discovered the truth, he would likely insist on treatment, on rest, on all the things she had convinced herself she didn't have time for, while there were others who needed her more. She told herself she would deal with the wound properly soon, once things settled down, once the immediate demands on her time eased. It was the same promise she had made to herself for 3 days now, each day passing with the same excuses, the same delays, the same quiet insistence that her pain could wait just a little longer. Outside, the night deepened over the palace grounds, and within the walls of the royal study, Kale sat awake far longer than usual, his thoughts circling back again and again to the healer who had stitched his wound without complaint, and now seemed determined to hide one of her own. He didn't yet understand the full scope of what she was carrying, the weight of an injury sustained in service of protecting children who would never know her name, but the unease in his chest continued to grow with each passing hour, a quiet certainty that something needed to be done before it was too late. He resolved to speak with her again the following day, more directly this time, less willing to accept vague deflections about tiredness and sore muscles. Whatever she was hiding, he intended to find out, even if it meant pushing past the careful boundaries she had constructed around herself. What he didn't know was that time was already running shorter than either of them realized, and the quiet infection spreading beneath Illyra's bandage would soon force the truth into the open in a way neither of them could control. The morning sun had barely risen when a messenger arrived at Illyra's door, informing her that the king required her presence in the training yard immediately. She dressed quickly, her arm throbbing with a persistent ache that she pushed aside as best she could, and made her way through the palace corridors toward the open grounds where warriors were already gathering for the day's exercises. Kale stood near the center of the yard, watching a group of younger fighters practice their forms under the supervision of one of his senior warriors. When he spotted Alira approaching, he broke away from the group and walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "You said you needed a healer," Alira said, glancing around at the training session that appeared to be proceeding without any obvious injuries requiring attention. "One of my warriors took a hit to the shoulder yesterday," Kale said, gesturing toward a young man sitting on a bench near the edge of the yard, rubbing at his shoulder with a grimace. "I want you to look at it." Alira studied the king for a moment, sensing there was more to this request than he was letting on, though she said nothing, and simply followed him toward the injured warrior. The examination itself was straightforward, a minor strain that would heal on its own, with rest and a warm compress, hardly requiring the specific attention of a healer, rather than any of the other capable staff already present in the training yard. As she finished giving instructions to the young warrior, Kale remained close by, watching her work with the same quiet intensity he had shown during their previous encounters. When she finally straightened and turned to leave, he fell into step beside her, matching her pace as she walked back toward the palace. "You didn't need me for that," she said, not looking at him. "No," Kale admitted, "I didn't." "Then why call me here?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I wanted to ask you again about your arm." Alira's steps faltered slightly before she caught herself, her expression carefully composed as she continued walking. "I already told you, it's nothing." "You've been favoring it for days now," Kale said, his voice low but insistent. "I've watched you carry supplies, treat patients, even stitch wounds, all while avoiding putting any real pressure on that arm. That's not the behavior of someone dealing with simple tiredness." "You've been watching me closely," Alira said, a hint of something sharp entering her voice. "I have," Kale admitted without apology, "because I don't believe you're telling me the truth, and I'm concerned about what that might mean." Alira stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression that mixed frustration, with something more vulnerable underneath. "Why does it matter to you? I'm not one of your warriors. I'm not someone you're responsible for." "Everyone in this pack is someone I'm responsible for," Kale said firmly, including the healers who work themselves into exhaustion, treating everyone else while ignoring their own well-being. "That's not," Alira started, then stopped herself, pressing her lips together tightly. "That's not what," Kale pressed. She shook her head, looking away from him, toward the distant tree line beyond the training yard. "It doesn't matter. I'm handling it." "Are you?" Kale asked, stepping slightly closer. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're doing everything you can to avoid handling it at all." The silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled with things neither of them was quite ready to say. Alira felt the familiar urge to deflect, to offer some practiced explanation that would satisfy him enough to end the conversation, but something in his gaze made the usual excuses feel hollow, insufficient, in a way they hadn't before. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, her voice softer now. "But I know my own limits. I know when something requires attention and when it doesn't." Kale studied her for a long moment, unconvinced, but recognizing that pushing further would likely only drive her further into silence. He had learned enough about her in their brief acquaintance to understand that direct confrontation rarely worked, that she responded better to patience than to pressure, even when patience felt like the harder path to take. "All right," he said finally, though the concern remained evident in his tone. "But if that changes, if you need anything at all, I want you to come to me directly. Not to Garrick, not to one of the other healers, to me." Alira blinked, surprised by the specificity of the request. "Why would I come to you?" "Because I'm asking you to," Kale said simply, as though that explanation alone should be sufficient. She didn't quite know how to respond to that, the sincerity in his voice catching her off guard, in a way she wasn't prepared for. There was something different about the way he spoke to her, compared to how she imagined he spoke to most people in his court, less commanding and more genuine, as though he actually cared about her answer, rather than simply expecting compliance. "I'll keep that in mind," she said eventually, echoing the same non-committal response she had given him days before. Kale allowed a faint, knowing smile to cross his face, recognizing the deflection for what it was but choosing not to challenge it further. That's the second time you've told me that without any real intention of following through. Maybe I mean it more this time, Elira said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her own mouth despite herself. We'll see, Kale replied, and for a moment, the tension between them eased into something lighter, almost playful, a brief glimpse of ease that neither of them had expected to find in each other's company. They walked together for a while longer, the conversation shifting toward less personal topics, the state of the pack's medical supplies, the recovery progress of various injured warriors, the upcoming preparations for a gathering of neighboring pack leaders. Elira found herself relaxing slightly, despite the persistent ache in her arm, the easy rhythm of their conversation, offering a welcome distraction from the discomfort she had been carrying alone for days. It wasn't until they reached the entrance to the healer's quarters that Kale finally paused, turning to face her one last time before she disappeared inside. I mean what I said, he told her, his tone serious once more. If something is wrong, come to me. I would rather know and be able to help than find out later that I could have done something and didn't. Elira nodded slowly, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest at the sincerity in his words. I understand. She watched him walk away, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure against the morning light, and found herself thinking about how different this version of him seemed from the cold, distant king she had first encountered in that blood-soaked tent days ago. There was more beneath the surface than she had expected, a depth of care that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation throughout the region. Inside her quarters, alone once again, Elira allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to consider the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken since that first encounter. She told herself it didn't matter, that whatever curiosity Kale held toward her was temporary, born of nothing more than the novelty of someone who didn't cower in his presence. But some quiet part of her, one she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, wondered if there might be something more to it, something worth paying closer attention to. She pushed the thought aside for now, her mind returning instead to the wound beneath her sleeve, the persistent heat and swelling that continued to worsen, despite her best efforts to manage it alone. She knew she couldn't keep ignoring it forever. But not yet, she told herself. There was still time. There was still work to be done, other people who needed her attention more urgently than she needed her own. She didn't yet realize how badly that belief would be tested in the days that followed, or how quickly the careful balance she had maintained for so long was about to collapse entirely. Word travels quickly within the walls of a royal palace, and by the end of that week, the story of the healer, who had treated the Alpha King without fear, had spread through nearly every corner of the pack. Warriors spoke of it in hushed tones during training breaks, kitchen staff whispered about it while preparing meals, and even the senior healers, who had once dismissed Elira as a capable but unremarkable member of their ranks, began watching her with newfound curiosity whenever she passed through the halls. They're saying the king requested you specifically again yesterday, one of the younger healers, a woman named Ophelia Marsh, commented, as she and Elira organized supplies in the medical storeroom, for a shoulder strain that anyone could have treated. It wasn't anything unusual, Elira said, keeping her focus on the shelves in front of her, though she could feel the weight of Ophelia's curious gaze. That's not what people are saying, Ophelia pressed, a teasing lilt entering her voice. They're saying he's taken an interest in you, that you're the first healer he's ever called for by name. Elira felt heat rise to her cheeks, despite her best efforts to remain composed. People say a lot of things that aren't true. Maybe, Ophelia said, though her skeptical expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. But you have to admit, it's a little strange. The king has never shown interest in any of us before, not even the healers who've served the royal family for years. Elira didn't respond, choosing instead to focus intently on counting a stack of clean bandages, though her mind was far from the task in front of her. She had noticed the shift in how others looked at her over the past few days, the curious glances, the whispered conversations that quieted whenever she entered a room. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate, this sudden visibility after years of moving through the palace largely unnoticed. Later that day, as she made her rounds through the recovery wing, checking on warriors still healing from injuries sustained during the border conflict, Illyra overheard two guards discussing the same rumors near the entrance to the wing. I heard she stood up to him without flinching, one of them said. Didn't even bow when she walked into his tent. Can you imagine? I heard he's been finding excuses to keep her around ever since, the other replied. My cousin works in the kitchens. Says the king's been asking after her health, wanting to know if she's eating enough, resting enough. Never seen him care that much about anyone outside his inner circle. Illyra quickened her pace, moving past the guards without acknowledging what she had overheard, though the words lingered in her mind long after she had walked away. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled by the attention, torn between the quiet satisfaction of being noticed for the first time in years and the discomfort of having her private interactions become the subject of palace gossip. That evening, back in the small room she shared with Nadia, Illyra found herself unable to focus on the simple tasks she usually completed before bed, her mind circling back again and again to the strange new reality she found herself navigating. Nadia noticed her distraction almost immediately. You're thinking about him again, Nadia said, not looking up from the book she was reading. I'm not thinking about anyone, Illyra replied, though the denial came a beat too late to be convincing. Nadia set her book down, studying her roommate with an expression that mixed amusement and genuine curiosity. Illyra Voss, in all the time I've known you, I have never once seen you distracted by anything other than work. Not gossip, not romance, nothing. And now you can't sit still for more than 5 minutes without staring off into space. It's not what you think, Illyra said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Then what is it? Illyra hesitated, unsure how to put into words the confusing tangle of feelings that had settled in her chest since her encounters with Cale began. There was something undeniably different about the way he treated her, an attentiveness that felt genuine rather than performative, a concern for her well-being that seemed to extend beyond simple courtesy. It unsettled her precisely because it felt so unfamiliar, so at odds with everything she had learned to expect from the world around her. He asked me to come to him directly if something was wrong, Illyra said finally, not to send word through someone else, directly to him. Nadia's eyebrows rose. That's significant. It's probably nothing, Illyra said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Illyra, Nadia said gently, when was the last time anyone asked you to come to them if something was wrong? When was the last time anyone in this palace cared enough about your well-being to make that kind of offer? The question landed harder than Nadia likely intended, striking at something Illyra had spent years carefully avoiding examining too closely. She thought about her years of service, the countless hours spent tending to others' injuries while quietly nursing her own bruises and exhaustion, the slow accumulation of small moments where her own pain had been dismissed or simply overlooked because there was always someone else who needed help more urgently. It doesn't matter, Illyra said, pushing the uncomfortable thought aside. Even if he meant it, even if the offer was genuine, it doesn't change anything. I still have my duties. I still have patients who need me. And what about you? Nadia asked quietly. Who takes care of you while you're busy taking care of everyone else? Illyra didn't have an answer for that, the silence stretching between them until Nadia finally sighed and returned to her book, recognizing the familiar wall going up once again. But the question lingered in Illyra's mind long after the conversation ended, refusing to fade, even as she prepared for bed and tried to focus on the practical concerns of the following day. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the small room, Illyra found herself thinking about the wound still hidden beneath her sleeve, now noticeably worse than it had been just a day before. The fever had begun that morning, a subtle warmth that had settled into her body and refused to leave, though she had attributed it to exhaustion and continued through her duties regardless. Looking back now, she recognized the symptoms for what they truly were, the early signs of an infection that had progressed far beyond what simple rest and careful bandaging could resolve. She knew she should seek proper treatment. She had known it for days now, had recognized the warning signs even as she chose to ignore them in favor of continuing her work. But something in her resisted the idea of finally addressing it, some deep-rooted belief that her own needs would always come second, that acknowledging her pain now, after so many days of silence, would somehow make her seem weak or undeserving of the trust others had placed in her as a healer. It was a belief she had carried since childhood, since long before she had ever picked up a needle and thread to stitch a wound, rooted in years of being overlooked in favor of siblings and peers who seemed to require more attention, more care, more acknowledgement, simply by virtue of being louder about their needs. She had learned early that quiet suffering earned little sympathy, that the path to being valued lay in making herself useful rather than making herself heard. Cale's offer, sincere as it had seemed, felt almost impossible to accept within that framework. To go to him and admit that something was wrong would mean acknowledging a vulnerability she had spent years learning to hide, and some part of her feared that doing so would shatter whatever fragile connection had begun to form between them, that he would see her differently once he understood the extent of what she had been hiding. She drifted into a restless sleep eventually, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion despite the persistent ache in her arm and the low fever simmering beneath her skin. She didn't know that the following day would bring an end to her careful concealment, that the infection spreading through her arm had already progressed to a point where her body would no longer allow her to continue pretending everything was fine. For now, she slept, unaware of how close she was to losing control of the secret she had guarded so carefully for nearly a week. The council chamber was full that morning. Senior members of the pack gathered around the long wooden table to discuss preparations for the upcoming meeting with neighboring pack leaders. Cale sat at the head of the table, half listening to a report on supply logistics, while his attention repeatedly drifted toward the door, waiting for a particular arrival that had become an increasingly regular occurrence in these meetings. He had begun requesting Alira's presence at select council sessions, framing it as a need for healers' counsel regarding the physical condition of warriors who would be representing the pack during the gathering. It was a thin excuse, one that Garrick had pointed out more than once wasn't entirely necessary given the presence of the pack's chief healer, an older woman named Winifred, who had served the royal family for decades and was more than capable of providing whatever counsel was needed. But Cale found himself wanting Alira's perspective specifically, valuing the direct, unvarnished way she assessed situations without the careful political calculation that colored so many of the opinions offered around this table. She didn't flatter him, didn't shape her responses based on what she thought he wanted to hear. It was refreshing in a way he hadn't realized he needed until he experienced it. When she finally arrived, slipping quietly into the room and taking a seat near the back rather than at the main table, Cale felt something in his chest ease slightly, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it dissipated. He caught her eye briefly across the room, offering the smallest hint of a nod, and she returned it with a similarly subtle acknowledgement before turning her attention to the ongoing discussion. He noticed, as he had been noticing more frequently, that she still favored her left arm, keeping it close to her body, in a way that suggested continued discomfort. It had been days since he first raised the question with her, and though she had assured him she was managing fine, the persistent stiffness in her movements told a different story, one he was growing increasingly uneasy about. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from trade agreements to territorial boundaries, and Cale found his focus repeatedly drawn away from the discussion toward Alira, watching for any further signs that might confirm his growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. He noticed the way she occasionally pressed her right hand against her forehead, as though fighting off a headache. He noticed the faint sheen of perspiration on her brow despite the coolness of the room. He noticed, most concerning of all, the way her usually steady composure seemed to waver slightly, small moments of distraction that were entirely unlike her. When the meeting finally concluded, Cale found an excuse to linger near the door, waiting for Alira to pass by on her way out. She approached more slowly than usual, her steps lacking their typical confidence, and up close he could see clearly now what he had only suspected from across the room. Her face was pale, a stark contrast to the flush of color in her cheeks, and her eyes seemed unfocused, struggling to hold his gaze. "Alira," he said, stepping toward her with concern evident in his voice. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though the words came out slightly slurred, her balance shifting unsteadily as she tried to move past him. "You don't look fine," Cale said, reaching out instinctively to steady her as she swayed slightly on her feet. "I just need some air," she murmured, though even as she spoke, her legs seemed to lose their strength beneath her. Cale's arms were around her the instant she began to fall, catching her before she could collapse to the floor of the corridor. The sudden movement drew the attention of several council members still filing out of the chamber, their conversations halting abruptly as they turned to see their king holding the unconscious healer in his arms. "Someone get Winifred, now." Cale called out, his voice sharp with urgency, as he carefully lowered Alira to the ground, cradling her head against his arm. Her skin was burning hot beneath his touch, far too warm for a simple headache or minor exhaustion, and the realization sent a cold spike of fear through his chest. As he shifted her slightly to get a better look at her condition, his eyes fell on her left sleeve, and what he saw there stopped his breath entirely. The fabric was stained a deep, unmistakable red. Far too much blood to have come from anything minor. Far too concerning to have gone unnoticed for as long as it apparently had. "What is this?" Cale demanded, though there was no one nearby who could answer him. Alira herself unconscious, and unable to explain the wound that had clearly been hidden beneath layers of cloth for what looked like days. Garrick arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from down the hall, and his expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he took in the scene before him. His king, kneeling on the floor, with an unconscious healer in his arms, blood visible through her sleeve. "What happened?" Garrick asked, dropping to his knees beside them. "I don't know," Cale said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "She collapsed. And look at this." He gestured toward the stained sleeve, his hands trembling slightly as he carefully rolled it back to reveal the wound beneath. What they found made both men go still with shock. The skin around a set of deep claw marks had swollen significantly, an angry red and purple discoloration spreading outward from the wound itself, clear signs of a serious infection that had been left untreated for far too long. The makeshift bandage she had wrapped around it was soaked through, offering little protection against whatever damage had already been done. "She's been hiding this," Garrick said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. "For how long?" Cale asked, though the question was directed more at himself than at Garrick, a wave of guilt washing over him as he thought back to every moment over the past week, when he had noticed something was wrong, and had chosen patience over intervention, respect for her boundaries over the more urgent action that might have prevented this. Winifred arrived moments later, her expression immediately shifting to grave concern, as she knelt beside Alira and began examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "This needs immediate attention," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "The infection has spread significantly. If this had gone untreated much longer, we could have been looking at something far more serious than a fever." "Do whatever needs to be done," Cale said, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't entirely sure how to name. "Whatever she needs, spare no resource." Winifred nodded, quickly directing several nearby guards to help carry Alira to the medical wing, where proper treatment could finally begin. Cale insisted on carrying her himself, refusing to relinquish the responsibility to anyone else, his mind racing with questions he desperately needed answered. How long had she been carrying this injury? Why hadn't she said anything, especially after he had explicitly asked her to come to him if something was wrong? And most troubling of all, how had he failed to see the severity of what was happening right in front of him, despite all the small signs he had noticed and chosen not to act upon more forcefully? As he carried her through the palace corridors toward the medical wing, her small frame surprisingly light in his arms despite the strength he knew she carried within her, Cale found himself overwhelmed by a fierce protectiveness he hadn't fully anticipated feeling for anyone outside his closest circle. Whatever this connection was that had been building between them over the past week, it had clearly grown into something far more significant than simple curiosity, and the thought of losing her to something as preventable as an untreated wound left him with a hollow, aching fear he wasn't prepared to confront. They reached the medical wing quickly, and Winifred immediately took charge, directing her staff to prepare everything necessary for proper treatment. Cale reluctantly stepped back to allow the healer's room to work, though he refused to leave the room entirely, positioning himself near the door where he could watch over the proceedings and ensure nothing was overlooked in Alira's care. The next several hours would prove critical, Winifred explained, as they worked to clean the infected wound properly, administer medicine to bring down the dangerous fever, and monitor for any signs of the infection spreading further into her system. Cale listened to every word with grim focus, committing each detail to memory, determined to understand exactly what needed to happen to ensure her full recovery. Outside the treatment room, Garrick found his king pacing the corridor sometime later, unable to sit still despite the late hour, and the exhaustion clearly weighing on him after the stressful events of the day. "She'll be all right," Garrick said, attempting to offer some reassurance. Winifred caught it in time. "She shouldn't have had to catch it at all," Cale said, his voice tight with frustration directed as much at himself as at the situation itself. "I knew something was wrong. I saw the signs, and I let her convince me it was nothing, because I didn't want to push too hard." "You couldn't have forced her to admit something she was determined to hide," Garrick said gently. "I could have tried harder," Cale replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I should have insisted on an examination the moment I noticed her favoring that arm. Instead, I respected her privacy, and nearly let her suffer for it." Garrick didn't have a response for that, recognizing the truth in his king's words, even as he understood the impossible position Cale had found himself in, caught between respecting Alira's autonomy and acting on legitimate concern for her well-being. There had been no perfect path through that dilemma, no way to know for certain how serious the situation truly was, until it had already become critical. Inside the treatment room, Alira remained unconscious, as Winifred and her staff continued their careful work, cleaning the infection from her wound and administering the medicines necessary to fight off the fever that had taken hold of her body. It would be several more hours before she began to stir, and when she finally did wake, she would find herself facing a conversation she had spent nearly a week avoiding, one that could no longer be postponed or deflected away, with practiced excuses and careful half-truths. The secret she had guarded so carefully was out now, laid bare in the worst possible way, and there would be no taking back what had already been revealed. Consciousness returned slowly, in fragments, the world drifting in and out of focus, as Alira struggled to make sense of her surroundings. The first thing she registered was the softness beneath her, a bed far more comfortable than her own narrow cot, followed by the dull, persistent ache in her left arm that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. Her mouth felt dry, her thoughts sluggish, as though wading through thick fog to reach any coherent understanding of where she was or how she had gotten there. "She's waking up," a voice said nearby, one she vaguely recognized as belonging to Winifred, the senior healer whose steady presence had guided her own training years ago. Alira forced her eyes open, blinking against the bright light of the room, until her vision slowly adjusted. She was in the medical wing, she realized, in one of the private treatment rooms, typically reserved for the most serious cases. Winifred stood beside the bed, checking the bandage wrapped carefully around her arm, while another figure sat in a chair pulled close to the bedside, his large frame looking distinctly out of place among the delicate instruments and supplies of the healing quarters. Cale. Memory returned in a sudden, disorienting rush, the council meeting, the wave of dizziness that had overtaken her, the sensation of her legs giving out beneath her. She remembered his voice calling for help, remembered the strength of his arms catching her before everything went dark. "You're awake," Cale said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something more complicated underneath, an edge of restrained frustration that Alira recognized immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice raspier than she expected. "You collapsed," Winifred said, her tone carrying the particular briskness of a healer delivering difficult news. "The infection in your arm had progressed significantly. You're fortunate we caught it when we did, though I don't say that lightly. A few more days of neglect and we could have been dealing with something far more dangerous than a fever." Alira closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the situation settling over her with uncomfortable clarity. She had known, on some level, that the wound was worsening, had recognized the signs even as she chose to ignore them, in favor of continuing her usual routine. To hear it confirmed so plainly, to understand just how close she had come to a much more serious outcome, brought a wave of shame she wasn't prepared to face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure who the apology was directed toward. "Sorry isn't what I want from you right now," Cale said, and there was an edge to his voice that made Alira open her eyes again, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since waking. "I want to understand why. Why you said nothing. Not once. Not even when I asked you directly if something was wrong." Winifred, sensing the private nature of the conversation about to unfold, quietly excused herself from the room, leaving Cale and Alira alone amid the soft glow of the healing quarters' evening lighting. "It's complicated," Alira said, though even as she spoke, she recognized how insufficient the answer sounded. Try to uncomplicate it for me, Cale said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. Because from where I'm sitting, I watched a woman nearly die from an infection she could have easily prevented, all because she was too stubborn or too afraid to admit she needed help. The bluntness of his words stung, though Alira understood the fear driving them, recognized the same protective anger she had seen in family members of patients who had waited too long to seek treatment for something that could have been easily managed, if addressed early enough. I didn't think it was serious enough to bother anyone with, she said finally, the honesty of the admission feeling almost physically painful to voice aloud. There were so many others who needed treatment more urgently. I couldn't justify taking time away from them to worry about something as minor as a scratch. A minor scratch, Cale repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. Alira, the wound on your arm required stitches. It became infected enough to cause a dangerous fever and unconsciousness. That is not minor. It didn't feel that way when it happened, she said, her voice growing quieter. There were children in danger. I did what needed to be done to protect them, and the injury I sustained felt insignificant compared to what could have happened if I hadn't acted. Understanding began to dawn in Cale's expression, the pieces slowly falling into place. This happened during the retreat, protecting the pups. Alira nodded slightly, the memory still sharp despite the days that had passed since. A rogue wolf had gotten separated from the main group of attackers and found its way toward where several children were hiding. There wasn't time to call for help. I did what I could to keep it away from them until reinforcements arrived. You never mentioned this, Cale said, something in his voice softening, despite the lingering frustration. There wasn't any reason to, Alira said. It wasn't relevant to anything, and I certainly wasn't going to draw attention to it when there were far more serious injuries among the warriors who needed immediate care. Cale studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes as he processed everything she had just shared. You risked your life to protect children who probably don't even know your name, and then you spent the following week hiding the consequences of that sacrifice because you didn't think it was worth anyone's attention. When he put it that way, laid out so plainly, Alira found herself struggling to defend the logic that had seemed so reasonable at the time. I'm a healer, she said instead. It's my role to tend to others, not to be tended to myself. That's not how it works, Cale said, his voice firm but no longer sharp with anger, replaced instead by something gentler, more earnest. Healers get hurt too. Healers need care too. The fact that you spend your days tending to others doesn't mean your own pain matters any less. Alira felt something tighten in her throat, an unexpected wave of emotion rising in response to words she hadn't realized she needed to hear. It was a sentiment so foreign to everything she had internalized throughout her life, throughout years of learning, that her value came from what she could offer others, rather than any inherent worth she possessed on her own. No one has ever really said that to me before, she admitted quietly, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. Cale's expression shifted, the frustration in his eyes giving way entirely to something softer, more concerned. Then it's long past time someone did. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the blanket, before gently taking it in his own, careful not to jostle the arm still healing beneath its fresh bandage. You matter, Alira. Your pain matters. I need you to understand that, especially if you're going to continue insisting on throwing yourself in harm's way for the sake of others. The warmth of his hand around hers felt grounding in a way she hadn't expected, an anchor amid the disorientation of the past hour, the shame and vulnerability of having her carefully guarded secret exposed so completely. She found herself unable to look away from him, struck by the sincerity evident in every line of his expression. I didn't want you to think less of me, she said softly, giving voice to the fear that had kept her silent for so long. If I admitted I was hurt, if I let you see that I couldn't handle everything on my own, I worried you would see me as weak. Weak? Cale repeated, something almost incredulous in his voice. Alira, you walked into a tent to treat a king everyone else was too afraid to approach, all while hiding a serious injury of your own. There is nothing weak about that. If anything, it terrifies me how strong you're capable of being, even when that strength comes at your own expense. The words settled over her like a balm, easing something in her chest that had been tightly wound for longer than she could remember. She had spent so many years believing that acknowledging her own pain would somehow diminish her worth in the eyes of others. And here was this man, powerful and imposing as he was, telling her the exact opposite was true. They remained like that for a while, hands still clasped together, the silence between them comfortable now, rather than tense, filled with the quiet understanding that something significant had shifted between them over the course of this difficult conversation. Cale didn't let go of her hand, and Alira found she didn't particularly want him to. Eventually, exhaustion began to pull at her again, the effects of the fever and the ongoing treatment leaving her body craving rest, despite the emotional intensity of the conversation they had just shared. Cale noticed the way her eyes grew heavy, the way her grip on his hand loosened slightly as sleep began to claim her once more. "Rest," he said softly. "I'll be here." "You don't need to stay," Alira murmured, though the protest lacked any real conviction. "I know I don't need to," Cale said. "I want to." She drifted back to sleep, with his hand still holding hers, a quiet warmth settling over her, despite the lingering pain in her arm, and the exhaustion weighing down her body. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to simply rest, trusting that someone else was watching over her, that her well-being mattered enough to someone that she didn't need to carry the full weight of it alone. Outside the treatment room, word had already begun to spread through the palace about what had happened, about the king who had refused to leave the healer's bedside since her collapse, about the depth of concern he had shown for a woman most in the court had barely known existed until recently. The whispers that had once carried simple curiosity now carried something more, a growing understanding that whatever connection existed between the Alpha King and the quiet healer, it had clearly become something far more significant than anyone had initially realized. True to his word, Cale remained close throughout the following days, as Alira continued her recovery under Winifred's careful supervision. He rearranged his schedule to visit her twice daily, once in the morning before council meetings began, and again in the evening once the day's duties had concluded, bringing with him small gestures that spoke louder than words ever could: fresh fruit from the palace gardens, books from his private collection to help pass the tedious hours of bed rest, and always, without fail, the steady presence of someone genuinely invested in her well-being. "You don't have to keep coming here," Alira said on the third morning of his visits, though there was no real protest behind the words, only a lingering disbelief that this level of attention was being directed toward her. "I know," Cale replied, settling into the now familiar chair beside her bed. "I want to." It had become something of a routine between them, this gentle exchange, and Alira found herself smiling, despite her attempt to maintain some semblance of composure. The fever had broken 2 days earlier, and the swelling in her arm had begun to recede steadily under the careful treatment Winifred provided, though full recovery would still take time. "How are you feeling today?" Cale asked, his eyes moving briefly to the bandaged arm resting against the blanket. "Better," Alira admitted. "Winifred says the infection has cleared significantly. I should be back on my feet within the week." "Good," Cale said, though something in his expression suggested mixed feelings about that timeline, a part of him perhaps not entirely ready for these quiet visits to end once she returned to her normal duties. Their conversations during these visits had evolved beyond the careful, professional distance that had characterized their earlier interactions. Cale found himself sharing things he rarely discussed with anyone: the weight of leadership he carried since taking his father's place as Alpha King, far younger than he had ever anticipated; the loneliness that came with a position where nearly everyone around him wanted something, where genuine connection felt increasingly rare amid the constant political maneuvering of court life. "It's strange," he admitted during one such conversation, staring out the window rather than meeting her eyes directly. "I have advisors, warriors, an entire court of people who answer to me, and yet I don't think I've had an honest conversation with anyone in longer than I can remember, not until you." Alira considered his words carefully before responding, perhaps because everyone else is too busy trying to tell you what you want to hear, rather than what they actually think. "That's exactly it," Cale said, turning back to face her. "You've never once tried to flatter me, or shape your words to please me. Even that first day in the tent, you spoke to me like I was simply a man with an injury, not a king whose favor needed to be carefully courted." "Would you have preferred flattery?" Alira asked, a teasing note entering her voice. "No," Cale said immediately, a genuine smile crossing his face, one Alira had come to recognize as different from the careful, controlled expressions he wore in more public settings. I've had enough flattery to last several lifetimes. What I needed was honesty, and you gave me that without even realizing how rare a gift it was. In turn, Elira found herself opening up about aspects of her own life she rarely shared with anyone. The loss of her parents when she was still young, the years spent training under Winifred's predecessor, learning the delicate art of healing, amid a childhood that had taught her early to prioritize others' needs above her own. She spoke of the quiet loneliness that had characterized much of her adult life, the sense of moving through the palace, largely unseen, despite years of dedicated service. I never expected any of this, she admitted one evening, gesturing vaguely to indicate the room around them, the growing closeness between them, the strange turn her life had taken since that first encounter in the war tent. I've spent so long believing my role was simply to help others, without expecting anything in return. I don't quite know what to do with someone who seems determined to help me instead. Get used to it, Cale said simply, reaching for her hand, the way he had begun doing regularly during these visits. Because I have no intention of stopping. The words carried a weight beyond their simple meaning, a promise that Elira understood extended well beyond her current recovery, into whatever future might unfold between them as her health continued to improve. She found herself both terrified and cautiously hopeful at the prospect, unaccustomed as she was to the idea of someone offering genuine care without expecting something in return. Nadia visited frequently as well, bringing news from the healer's quarters and updates on the various patients Elira had been treating before her collapse, careful to ensure her friend didn't worry unnecessarily about duties that others had capably taken over in her absence. She noticed the shift in Elira's demeanor during these visits, the softness that had crept into her expression whenever conversation turned toward Cale, the light that seemed to have returned to eyes that had grown accustomed to quiet exhaustion. "You seem happy," Nadia observed one afternoon, settling into the chair Cale had vacated only an hour earlier. "I am," Elira said, and the simple honesty of the admission surprised even herself. "He's good for you," Nadia said, a knowing smile crossing her face. "I've never seen you let anyone take care of you the way you've let him these past few days." Elira considered this observation carefully, recognizing the truth in it, even as some old, familiar resistance stirred within her, a lingering discomfort with accepting help so openly, after years of believing she should manage everything alone. But that resistance felt weaker now, gradually eroding under the steady, patient presence Cale continued to offer, the consistent reassurance that her needs mattered just as much as anyone else's. "I'm trying," Elira said honestly. "It's harder than I expected, letting someone else worry about me for once. But I think I'm learning." "That's all anyone can do," Nadia said gently. "And for what it's worth, I think you deserve every bit of the care he's offering. You've spent years giving everything to everyone else. It's about time someone gave something back." As the days passed, and Elira's strength continued to return, the changes rippling outward from her collapse and subsequent recovery began to reshape not only her relationship with Cale, but her standing within the palace more broadly. Warriors, who had once barely acknowledged her presence, now greeted her warmly whenever their paths crossed. Senior healers who had previously overlooked her contributions began seeking her opinion on complex cases, recognizing a skill and dedication they had failed to properly value before. Cale noticed these shifts as well, quietly pleased to see Elira finally receiving the recognition she had long deserved, but rarely sought for herself. He made a point of publicly acknowledging her contributions whenever appropriate opportunities arose, careful never to embarrass her with excessive attention, but ensuring that her value to the pack was properly understood by those around her. By the end of the first week, Elira was strong enough to leave the medical wing entirely, though Winifred insisted on several more days of light duties before returning to her full workload. Cale accompanied her on her first walk through the palace gardens since her collapse, the late afternoon sun casting warm light across the carefully tended flower beds that lined the winding stone pathways. "It's beautiful out here," Elira said, breathing in the fresh air with evident appreciation after so many days confined to the medical wing. "I used to come here often as a child," Cale said, gesturing toward a particular bench nestled beneath a large flowering tree. "My mother loved these gardens. She used to say they reminded her that even in the midst of ruling a pack, there was still room for beauty and quiet moments." Elira glanced at him, sensing the rare vulnerability in sharing such a personal memory. "You don't talk about your mother often." "No," Cale admitted. "It's complicated. She passed when I was young, before I was ready to take on the responsibilities that came with losing her." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "You remind me of her, in some ways, the way you care for others without expecting recognition. She was the same way, always tending to the needs of everyone around her, often at the expense of her own well-being." The comparison struck something deep within Elira, an unexpected emotional weight settling over the quiet moment between them. "I hope that's meant as a compliment," she said softly. "It's the highest compliment I could possibly give," Cale replied, his voice thick with sincerity. "She was the best person I've ever known, until I met you." They sat together on the bench beneath the flowering tree as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the comfortable silence between them filled with unspoken understanding, a recognition that whatever had begun between them in that blood-soaked tent weeks ago had grown into something neither of them fully anticipated, but both were increasingly unwilling to walk away from. 2 weeks after her collapse, Elira returned to her full duties within the healer's quarters, her arm fully healed, save for a thin scar that would remain as a permanent reminder of the night she had chosen protecting children over protecting herself. The rhythm of her days settled back into familiar patterns, treating minor injuries among the warriors, assisting Winifred with more complex cases, organizing supplies, and training the younger healers, who looked to her now, with a newfound respect, that hadn't existed before her collapse. But everything else had changed. Cale continued to seek her out regularly, no longer bothering to construct elaborate excuses about council meetings or minor training injuries. He simply sought her company because he wanted it, and Elira found herself equally drawn to spend whatever time she could steal away from her duties in his presence. Their evening walks through the palace gardens became a cherished routine, quiet conversations that ranged from the mundane details of daily life to deeper reflections on leadership, loss, and the strange, unexpected paths that had brought them together. The rest of the pack noticed the shift in their dynamic as well, whispers of romance now openly discussed rather than carefully speculated, though neither Cale nor Elira had made any formal announcement about the nature of their relationship. Some members of the court regarded the development with genuine warmth, pleased to see their king finding companionship with someone who clearly cared for him beyond his title and position. Others, particularly those who had hoped to secure alliances through more traditional political matches, viewed the situation with less enthusiasm, though none dared voice their objections directly to Cale. It was during a formal gathering of the Pack Council, called to finalize preparations for the upcoming meeting with neighboring pack leaders, that matters finally came to a public head. Elira had been asked to attend as a healer's representative, providing updates on the pack's medical readiness should any complications arise during the diplomatic proceedings. She stood near the back of the chamber as she usually did, prepared to offer her report, and then retreat quietly, once her portion of the meeting concluded. But Cale had other plans. "Before we conclude today's session," he said, rising from his seat at the head of the table once the primary business had been addressed, "there's a matter I'd like to address publicly." The room fell silent, council members exchanging curious glances, as Cale's gaze moved toward the back of the chamber, settling on Elira with an expression that made her stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "Several weeks ago," Cale began, "this pack nearly lost one of its most valuable members, not to an enemy attack, but to silence. To a healer who believed so deeply in prioritizing others' needs above her own that she nearly paid the ultimate price for her selflessness." Murmurs rippled through the gathered council members, many of whom had heard fragments of the story, but had never received a full accounting of what had transpired. "Elira Voss," Cale continued, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "risked her own life to protect children during the chaos of our recent conflict. Sustaining an injury, she chose to hide, rather than seek proper treatment, because she believed her own pain mattered less than the needs of others around her." Elira felt heat rise to her cheeks, as every eye in the room turned toward her, the public attention far more overwhelming than anything she had experienced during their private conversations over the past weeks. She wanted to shrink back, to disappear from the sudden scrutiny, but found herself unable to look away from Cale as he continued speaking. "This pack has, for too long, allowed the quiet, tireless work of healers like Elira to go unrecognized, taking for granted the sacrifices made on our behalf, while reserving our praise and gratitude for warriors who fight more visible battles. I intend to correct that oversight, starting today." He gestured for Alira to step forward, and though every instinct told her to remain in the safety of the back row, she found herself walking toward him regardless, drawn by the sincerity and pride evident in his expression. "Effective immediately," Cale announced once she stood beside him. "Alira Voss will serve as my personal healer, a position of significant standing within this court, with all the recognition and resources that role entails. But more than that, I want it clearly understood throughout this pack that her well-being matters as much as anyone else's within these walls. Never again should a member of this pack feel that their own pain is unworthy of attention or care, regardless of how tirelessly they work to alleviate the suffering of others." The council chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and animated discussion, the announcement carrying implications that extended well beyond a simple title change. Alira stood beside Cale, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances, the public acknowledgement of contributions she had spent years believing would always go unnoticed. As the meeting concluded and council members began filing out of the chamber, offering their congratulations as they passed, Alira found herself alone with Cale for the first time since his announcement, the weight of everything that had just transpired settling over her in quiet waves. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, once the last of the council members had departed. "Yes, I did," Cale replied, turning to face her fully. "You've spent your entire life believing your needs come second to everyone else's. I wanted the whole court to understand, clearly and unmistakably, that this belief was never true, and it certainly won't be true going forward." Alira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, an overwhelming rush of emotion she hadn't fully anticipated. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with feeling. "There's something else," Cale said, reaching for her hands and holding them gently within his own. "I want to properly thank you, not just publicly before the council, but privately, for what you did that day in the tent, and every day since. You saved my life, and in the process, taught me something I desperately needed to learn about strength, about the quiet, unrecognized courage it takes to keep giving, even when no one is watching, even when the giving comes at great personal cost." "I was just doing my job," Alira said, though the familiar deflection felt weaker now, less convincing even to herself. "No," Cale said firmly, his thumb tracing gentle circles across the back of her hand. "You were being who you truly are, someone who cares deeply, who acts with courage, even when it terrifies her, who gives everything she has, without ever expecting recognition in return. That's not just doing a job, Alira. That's who you fundamentally are, and it's one of the many reasons I've come to care for you so deeply." The sincerity in his voice, combined with the weight of everything that had unfolded over the past several weeks, left Alira momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling evident in every word he spoke. "I never expected any of this," she admitted finally, echoing sentiments she had shared with him during her recovery. "I walked into that tent expecting nothing more than to treat a wound and leave. I never imagined it would lead here." "Neither did I," Cale said, a warm smile spreading across his face, "but I'm grateful every day that it did." He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a simple gesture that carried far more weight than any elaborate declaration could have conveyed. Alira felt her heart swell with an emotion she had rarely allowed herself to fully experience, a growing certainty that whatever future lay ahead of them, she would no longer face it in the quiet, self-sacrificing solitude that had defined so much of her life until now. "From this moment forward," Cale said softly, his eyes holding hers with unwavering sincerity, "your pain will never go unnoticed again. I promise you that, Alira. Whatever you carry, whatever burdens you're tempted to bear alone, know that you no longer have to. I'm here, and I intend to stay here, for as long as you'll have me." Alira felt the last remnants of her carefully constructed walls finally crumble entirely, replaced by a warmth and security she had never quite allowed herself to imagine possible. She thought back to that first day in the war tent, to the stubborn, guarded king who had refused treatment from anyone, until a quiet healer with her own hidden wound had walked in without fear. Neither of them could have known then how profoundly that single encounter would reshape both their lives, weaving together two people who had each spent too long believing they had to carry everything alone. Outside the council chamber, Word of Kale's announcement spread quickly through the palace, carrying with it a new understanding of the woman who had once moved through these halls largely unnoticed. Elira Voss was no longer simply a healer, treating whoever needed care. She had become something far more significant. A woman whose quiet strength had captured the heart of the Alpha King, whose selfless courage had finally been recognized and celebrated in the way it always deserved. As evening settled over the palace grounds, Kale and Elira walked together through the gardens one final time that day, hand in hand beneath the darkening sky, the promise of a new beginning stretching out before them, built on honesty, genuine care, and the hard-won understanding that even the strongest hearts deserve to be tended to with the same gentleness they so freely offer everyone else. The story that had begun with a wound treated in silence had finally found its resolution, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the simple, profound truth that had been quietly growing between them all along, that even a king could learn to see the pain hidden behind quiet strength, and that even the most selfless healer deserved, at last, to be healed and cherished in return. The gathering of neighboring pack leaders arrived a month later, bringing with it a flurry of preparation throughout the palace, banners raised along the main hall, additional guards stationed at every entrance, and a steady stream of dignitaries arriving from territories across the region. Elira stood at Kale's side during the formal opening ceremony, her new role as his personal healer granting her a place among the honored attendants rather than tucked away among the palace staff as she once would have been. She wore a deep green gown, chosen carefully to complement the formal setting, though she still felt the familiar pull of nervousness at being so visibly present among leaders and dignitaries who commanded far more political weight than she had ever navigated before. Kale, sensing her unease, found a quiet moment to lean close during a brief lull in the proceedings. "You look like you're about to bolt for the nearest exit," he murmured, a teasing smile softening the observation. "I'm considering it," Elira admitted quietly. "I'm used to treating wounds in quiet rooms, not standing beside kings while foreign dignitaries evaluate every detail of my appearance." "They're not evaluating you," Kale said. "They're wondering who the woman is that finally managed to soften the notoriously guarded Alpha King." Elira felt a flush rise to her cheeks despite herself. "Is that what people are saying?" "Among other things," Kale said, his eyes warm with amusement. "Most of it, far more flattering than you'd expect." As the gathering progressed through its formal agenda, Elira found her role expanding naturally, beyond simple ceremonial presence. When a visiting pack leader's aide fell ill partway through the proceedings, complaining of sudden stomach pain, it was Elira who calmly stepped forward to assess the situation, diagnosing a minor case of food sensitivity within minutes, and providing simple remedies that resolved the issue before it could disrupt the broader diplomatic discussions. Several of the visiting leaders took notice, murmuring quiet approval at the competence and calm authority she demonstrated, qualities that reflected well not only on her, but on the pack she represented. Kale watched with quiet pride from across the room, recognizing that Elira's genuine skill and steady presence were doing more to strengthen impressions of his leadership than any carefully rehearsed political maneuvering could have accomplished. That evening, as the formal proceedings gave way to a more relaxed banquet celebrating the successful first day of negotiations, Kale found Elira standing near one of the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, having slipped away from the noise and crowds for a few quiet moments to herself. "Hiding again?" he asked, joining her by the window. "Just breathing," she replied with a small smile. "It's a lot, all of this." "You handled it beautifully," Kale said, settling beside her. "Better than most people who've spent their entire lives training for exactly this kind of setting." "I still feel like I don't quite belong here," Elira admitted, watching the gentle sway of flowering branches in the evening breeze. Kale turned to face her fully, his expression growing serious, despite the light atmosphere of the celebration continuing behind them. "You belong wherever I am, Elira. That was true the moment you walked into that tent without fear, and it remains true now, whether we're standing among warriors on a training ground or dignitaries in a formal banquet hall." She met his gaze, finding in it the same steady sincerity that had carried her through the difficult weeks of her recovery, the same unwavering care that had transformed a chance encounter over a battlefield wound into something neither of them could have anticipated. "I used to think my worth came from what I could give to others," Elira said softly, giving voice to a realization that had been slowly taking shape within her over the past month. That the only way to matter was to keep working, keep helping, keep pouring myself into everyone else's needs while ignoring my own. And now, Kale asked gently. Now I'm learning that I can matter simply by being myself, she said, a small, genuine smile spreading across her face. That someone can care about me not because of what I do for them, but simply because of who I am. Kale reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with practiced familiarity, the gesture no longer carrying the tentative uncertainty of their earlier interactions, but instead a comfortable, settled affection that had grown steadily over their weeks together. You've taught me something similar, he admitted. I spent years believing that strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting when something hurt, never letting anyone close enough to see the parts of myself I kept carefully hidden behind duty and responsibility. You showed me a different kind of strength, one built on honesty rather than concealment, on trusting someone enough to let them see you fully, wounds and all. They stood together by the window for a long while, watching the moonlight play across the garden below, the sounds of celebration continuing behind them, distant and unimportant compared to the quiet understanding passing between them in this private moment. The path that had brought them together had been an unlikely one, born from crisis and hidden pain, but it had led to something neither of them had expected to find, a partnership built not on politics or convenience, but on genuine care freely given, and finally, fully received. As the night deepened, and the gathering of pack leaders continued its celebration, Elira found herself thinking back to that first day in the war tent, to the trembling hands she had steadied through sheer determination, to the wound she had hidden out of a lifetime of believing her pain mattered less than everyone else's. So much had changed since then, not just in her circumstances, but in the quiet, fundamental way she understood her own worth. She was no longer the healer who moved unnoticed through palace halls, tending to others, while silently carrying her own burdens alone. She had become something more, someone whose strength had been recognized, whose care had been returned in equal measure, whose quiet sacrifice had ultimately led her to a place of genuine belonging she had never quite believed she deserved. Kale squeezed her hand gently, drawing her attention back to the present moment, to the warmth of his presence beside her, and the promise of everything still to come. "Ready to go back in?" he asked softly. Elira glanced once more at the peaceful garden below, then turned to meet his eyes, a steady, contented certainty settling over her that she carried with her as they walked back together into the light and warmth of the celebration ahead, no longer a quiet healer working in the shadows, but a woman finally, fully seen,